This summer, we've been on a road trip of teachings with Jesus as he has accompanied his disciples and has set his face towards Jerusalem. There's been much that we've heard about the life of discipleship, about the calling to doing, and last week in an encounter with Mary and Martha about the importance of being acquainted with the very words of Jesus and letting those shape our hearts. And today, as you have heard, the teaching is about prayer. About prayer. Teach us to pray like John taught his disciples. What strikes me in this little section of the gospel that's on prayer aren't just the words that are so familiar to us, words that form the basis of our worship each Sunday as we pray what we have come to know as the Lord's Prayer, but also the little illustrations around it. So let's pause and just hear what Jesus said just a moment. Those teachings that are very basic for how do we pray, teaching us to pray to God as one who is in relationship to us, to one who is as a father, teaching us to pray for the kingdom, to pray for God's vision to be made known in the world, teaching us to focus only on this day, to pray only for this day's needs to be met, teaching us the importance of forgiveness so that there is nothing that stands in the way of our relationship with God or with each other, teaching us to pray for protection, that we not lose our way, that we stay focused on our life of discipleship. So there are these basic elements that are given to us. And this is what the life of discipleship, this is what the life of faith looks like. But then there are these two quick little teachings that happen that follow. One is about a grumpy friend who is willing to answer his neighbor's need. And one is about a parent, a faithful parent, who also seeks to give to their child. And in those two little additional teachings, it seems to me that we learn about God as we are also learning how to pray. And that we have an assurance that this God that we are seeking to relate to in prayer, that Jesus is making known for us, that Jesus is inviting us to relate to, is a God who is inviting us into a relationship of love and a relationship of hope. A relationship of love and a relationship of hope. That what we have here is an assurance that our relationship to God is not transactional. Prayer is not we put in our quarter and hope to get something back. Prayer is not we put in our request and hope that we get something in return that looks similar to what we had our heart set on. Instead, prayer is relational. Prayer is transformational as it invites us to share in God's vision and God's work and to be transformed by the very love of God, to be a people of hope as we are those who make God's kingdom known in the world. There are two books that help me think about this. One of them, and it's their titles as much as anything that helps me. One of them is called To Pray and to Love. To Pray and to Love. It's a small book by Roberta Bondi. She talks about prayer being an instrument, an experience, a resource that we have for having our hearts and our lives so shaped that we're better able to love God and love our neighbors. And she says this. She says the most important thing we do is show up. Is just show up, to be present, to be available, to be willing to receive what God would seek to offer us. She said we show up to God in prayer, but we also show up for each other. When there are those moments in our life's journeys where it is too difficult, it seems, for us to show up by ourselves, that we come alongside each other, that prayer reminds us that this life of discipleship is something that we do together in response to God's calling and God's work to love God and to love each other. The second book that teaches me about prayer and that I was reminded of as I've read these stories and words of encouragement from Jesus about what prayer is like. And it's a title by Eugene Peterson. It says, "A Long Obedience in the Same Direction." That's the title, "A Long Obedience in the Same Direction." I love that image because sometimes we want discipleship to be a quick fix, an instantaneous kind of experience that we profess our faith and then life is all shaped up just as we would have it. That's not my experience. And I don't think that's any of our experience, and I don't think it's what Jesus is calling us to. Instead, we're called to a long obedience in the same direction, a saying yes over and over again, step after step after step, as we continue to follow Jesus. His subtitle is Discipleship in an Instant Society. In an instant society. Eugene Peterson says this. He says, prayer is not an attempt to get God to do what he's unwilling otherwise to do, but is a reaching out to what we know that he does do, an expressed longing to receive what God is doing in and for us in Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to talk about hope. And I think it's important for us to hear the hope that is generated when we realize that God does seek to transform us. God does seek to live in relationship. God does seek to change not only us, but all the world through us. There's a hope that comes with knowing we're not begging God to do something. We're responding to what God is already doing. So hear his words about hoping. Eugene Peterson says, hoping does not mean doing nothing. It is not fatalistic resignation. It means going about our assigned task, confident that God will provide the meaning and the conclusions. It is not compelled to work away at keeping up appearances with a bogus spirituality. It is the opposite of desperate and panicky manipulations of scurrying and worrying. And hoping is not dreaming. It is not spinning an illusion or fantasy to protect us from our boredom or our pain. It means a confident, alert expectation that God will do what he said he will do. It is imagination put in the harness of faith. It is a willingness to let God do it his way and in his time. It is the opposite of making plans that we demand that God put into effect, telling him both how and when to do it. Hear these words. That is not hoping in God, but bullying God. I pray to God, my life of prayer, and wait for what he'll say and do. My life's on the line before God, my Lord, waiting and watching till morning. Waiting and watching till morning. Well, this road trip of discipleship is a long obedience in the same direction. And it's one where we learn to love and learn to hope as we continue to open ourselves by showing up and by being aware. We continue to open ourselves to receive what God will offer to us. I have friends who have a college son who is doing an internship in Atlanta this year. This summer, he's spending his time helping in a homeless ministry. He's one of the persons who does intake for people who are needing assistance of various kinds. And he was asked to write an essay about his first month in this internship. I want to share with you parts of what he says in his essay, College Junior. He says, every morning begins about the same, that as a team they gather in the back room for a time to pray, a time to celebrate joys, a time to share concerns. It says it gives them a chance to sort of breathe before they move into what the day will bring them, which can vary from day to day. He said he's loved what they do at the beginning, but recently he's been paying attention to what they do at the end of the day, and that it has struck him that they end their days, regardless of how they've gone, shutting down their computers and sort of reflecting on what their experiences are, and then saying, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow. He says as he's reflected on how they end their days, he's been thinking about a sign that's in the workroom where they gather each morning. An old sign on faded paper with faded masking tape that says this: do not depend on the hope of results. Do not depend on the hope of results. He said at first he thought it was sort of pessimistic. And then he kept working and realized that there were days he got to celebrate with those that he helped get a valid ID, who'd been waiting for months for it to arrive. And then there were days where he had persons who were agitated and disturbed in ways that he could not console, that he could not address, and that he would sort of end with a hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. But he said over and over again, he found himself aware that when it was time to leave for the day, he'd gather his coffee cup and backpack and wave as he headed for the door and say, I'll see you tomorrow. And over again, his eyes would fall on the words, do not depend on the hope of results. He said there's more to what's on that poster, and this is what else it says. It says as you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the righteousness, the truth of the work itself. And he said as he took that in, it began to change how he was relating to those who came to this particular agency, that he became more aware of the relationships that he could develop, that he found himself developing a new sense of purpose, one where he was grateful for the few moments in time that he might have to listen, to possibly take action, but just to be aware of the story of another who came his way. And he says he's learned. Sometimes he's able to help, and sometimes discouragement is inevitable. And that if he shifts his focus to himself, that he gets discouraged. But if he shifts his focus to the worth of the work itself, he's able to let each day manage its own challenges. He says lately, as the days have gone by, he hadn't counted the number of guests he served. Instead, he's been valuing the work itself. He says despite the potential for disappointment, whether or not he feels discouraged is irrelevant. Presence, attentiveness, and action is relevant. And that's where he's choosing to ground himself. And he says it's because of that when 12:30 rolls around, his time to end each day, that he gathers his coffee cup, looks around the back room, waves at his coworkers, and says to them, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow. You see, this life of prayer is calling us to a life of discipleship. And a life of discipleship invites us to share in God's kingdom work of love, work of hope. And a lot of it It's just about showing up and continuing to let God do God's transforming work in us and through us for the world. This life of discipleship is a life of hope, a life of sharing in God's kingdom, and of pointing to something, more specifically, pointing to someone who's beyond the immediate. And as we do that, then we gain purpose and direction. The very Spirit of God guides us, sustains us, and empowers us so that we can point the way to God's kingdom, to God's vision. There's something more going on here in this life of prayer than just our wants and our wishes. There's an eternal nature to our everyday lives. So we show up, we persevere, and we live and love as people of hope. May our words join those of those first disciples. Lord, teach us to pray. Teach us to pray so that we can live each day in a way that your kingdom comes through us. Amen.